Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio, and this is Webster Tarpley reporting to you from Washington, D.C. So we've got these big events going on. We've got the dumpster fire known as the Republican National Convention. It's going to be a grand guignol of horror and ineptitude, stupidity, bungling, racist venom, bigotry, union busting, presided over by this the Moloch of our times, Trump, now joined by Mike Pence of Indiana, who continues, the tradition of dummies, morons coming from Indiana. And, of course, Dan Quayle was a great exemplar of that tradition. So we'll find out if Pence can spell potato and similar other embarrassing facts. We have to deal with more terrorism now in the south of France, and we're going to have to talk about the presence of Freemasons in the French government, because that seems to be one of the causes, right? There's no reason why that truck should have gotten through. They needed barriers. How come they don't have barriers? Well, you have an interior minister, Cazeneuve, Bernard Cazeneuve, who has now failed 3 times in a country where normally, under ministerial responsibility, 1 strike and you're out. That should be the rule for government ministers, cabinet secretaries, agency heads, and the like. 1 strike and you're out. And you should know that. So don't let it happen. If you want to stay in power, control your own moles. Control the moles in your ministry. So we'll talk about that too. But now look, let's talk about some hopeful stuff. The entire U.S. coverage of terrorism and many other topics is vitiated, right? It's ruined by the fact that it's taking place in a vacuum of unreality. In other words, Trump can get up there and say, Obama hasn't done anything. He's done nothing. And you go to Fox and Friends and these ridiculous Rupert Murdoch broadcasts, and you see the blonde Cupid dolls lining up to say, twittering or tweeting, whatever they do, that nothing has been done to stop ISIS. Well, don't look now, but ISIS is now announcing to its own followers, they're announcing that they're collapsing. They're basically saying, jihadis, brace yourselves, because this entire caliphate is going to be wiped out, probably before the end of the year. I hope before November 8th. We need to see the ISIS caliphate go down to ignominious defeat, and a lot of those butchers should get what's coming to them in the process. It would be impossible for the Trump candidacy to run the way it does if the U.S. controlled corporate media, and that means MSNBC may be worst of all, but CNN and Fox, of course, if they weren't lying blatantly, and again, it's largely by omission about what's happening in the Middle East, right? Have you ever heard of the town Manbij? Have you ever heard of that on the big 3 cable news, or for that matter, on the other 3 who do evening news broadcasts, or 4, whatever it is? You don't hear these things. In other words, the average American has no clue what's happening. That the Jarablus corridor is in the process of being cut. That Manbij is under siege. That Raqqa will be next. It's clear. That's where they're going. And that the city of Mosul, with 2 million people, the largest agglomeration controlled by the ISIS butchers, that is going to be on the list very, very soon. Obama promised to conquer, to liberate Mosul by the end of the year. Obama, Barkey, let's make it the end of October. Why not? Because after that, the Mediterranean rains come in, right? And it's going to be harder after that. So this unreality, I think we have to point to this again and again and again. You'd normally think the Democrats would correct this, right? That they would somehow force the coverage. But of course, they're so afraid of their mushhead base, right? That don't like military activities, that they haven't got the guts. I would tell the Democrats, make your convention, among other things, into an infomercial for the fact that, say what you will, the U.S. strategy, the Obama strategy, call it that, in order to deal with ISIS is succeeding. And all the warmongers, this is actually an anti-warmonger strategy because it says this is going to be over soon. Whereas the warmongers, like Brian Williams last night, they're saying, oh, we've got to finally attack Assad. I've seen that from Brian Williams. He was interviewing the former failed CIA boss Woolsey, a neocon in the Democratic administration. I've seen this from Christiane Amanpour on CNN. She says, we've got to go after Assad. She's nuts. And if you saw the NBC News interview with President Assad, you saw somebody who is humanly far superior to his adversaries, right? He showed statesmanship. He is disciplined. He is very wise. The NBC correspondent, a British, tried to bait him into saying things about the U.S. Presidential election, and Assad was completely on the line of no comment. These are not our affairs. They only lie. We see no difference. When they get into power, we will measure them by their deeds. For somebody in Assad's position, that's very good. So he wisely refrained from saying anything about Trump, because of course Trump has promised to plaster his country with bombing campaigns. Now, let me just get to the overall point. Now, again, is we have this situation where ISIS, Daesh, in their own publications, they're trying to make a theological case that you can still be the caliphate even if you have no territory, that you can have the caliphate of the mind or of the will. And this will not fly, because that was the big deal with Daesh. For the first time since the early 1920s, there was a territorial caliphate. So Daesh will tell their crazy followers, but the U.S. media won't tell you that ISIS is dying. They're getting smashed. They're retreating on all fronts. In the town of Manbij, this key crossroads in the middle of the Jarablus corridor, Manbij, ISIS had been slammed and forced to retreat. In the past week or so, ISIS has tried to mount a desperation counteroffensive, but it looks to me like that has been smashed too. So we're getting to a point where the resistance in Manbij is going to be quelled, and at that point, those same forces can go on to Raqqa. Raqqa is now cut off, and of course that entire corridor into Turkey, where they get new, crazed, fanatic, duped, deluded, psychotic recruits, spare parts, ammunition, various kinds of fuels, and so forth. So that is happening, and just one second. The U.S. media don't tell you about that. So the last-ditch attempt by ISIS to do that has been defeated. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. For all of your information needs during the dumpster fire, during the Grand Guignol of the Republican National Convention, go to tarpley.net. We'll have various kinds of coverage. I'll be live tweeting part of it, and probably do some special reports, some in writing, some maybe on video. So we'll make sure that those goings on are thoroughly exposed. But now, remember, If you want to know who the ruling class is supporting, turn on the TV. What do you see? It's Trump. That's who the ruling class is supporting, right? It's obviously embarrassing for them, right? They have to do it in a careful, sort of stealthy way, because otherwise they're going to get boycotted and what have you. And that may happen. One interesting thing, the daughters, these little daughters, young daughters of Rupert Murdoch, right? The arch reactionary of the world, right? The withered mummy of British imperialism. Don't tell me that guy's an American. He is none. He's a British Empire. He's a United Empire loyalist. That's Rupert Murdoch. So those little girls were the flower girls at the wedding of Trump and who? Of the most recent, of Melania? Or maybe it was Marla Maples. I forget. It must be the most recent one, Melania. All right. Now look, big important diplomacy in Moscow. So Kerry meets with Lavrov and then with Lavrov and Putin. And the goal here is cooperation of the United States and Russia against ISIS on the one hand and Nusra, meaning Al-Qaeda, on the other. And the U.S. proposal was leaked yesterday by the Washington Post. You can see it certainly on their website. So it's a working paper. Today was the second day of the talks among Putin, Kerry, and Lavrov. So there's nothing specific about that working paper because the working paper is theoretically not public. So they don't say, yes, we've accepted the U.S. Proposal or not, right? So they don't say that. But the idea is this Peskov, the spokesperson for Putin, says in general, forget the details, we're generally in favor of working with the U.S. in Syria. Now, it would involve the creation of what is called a joint implementation group, and that would be a permanent, open-ended center of coordination and command and control for the respective air forces of the Russian Federation and the United States. This would be located in Jordan, and the idea is it's sort of like a permanent contact facility. So you have a Russian headquarters sitting in Jordan. You'll have a U.S. headquarters sitting in Jordan also, close by. And then there'll be a third point, a third office facility, filter room, whatever you want. And that's where the stuff will be brought together. And that's where the negotiations will occur among officers of the same rank, approximately, who will then figure out who to bomb. And the big deal now is ISIS is on the target list, and also you'll hear that Nusra Brigade is on the target list. Now, this is important because, look, there's no use kidding yourself. During the first phase of Russian bombing, starting last September, October, Russia, by and large, did not attack ISIS. There's no way around it. They attacked other groups, the Nusra and Free Syrian Army and these other groups that were, because of their geographic position, they were much more threatening to the Assad government. This is normal. I've always said this is what they do, and this is what they ought to do. It's what you expect them to do. Because remember, one of the things about ISIS is that ISIS didn't want to fight Assad. They went off and wanted to conquer territory and create their caliphate, and their attacks were largely directed in the other direction, towards Iraq. They tried to get to Baghdad. Then they could have had the Caliph of Baghdad, but they didn't succeed with that. So the JIG, and I hope this happens. Right? I see many things here. This is a positive step towards the condominium, the U.S.-Russian cooperation, which ought to start with the Middle East. Right? You can start with Syria. You might then be able to go on to the Israeli-Palestinian question, right? The United States and Russia acting together could force some rationality on the participants of any number of disputes. And that's what we want. We want these quarrels among petty, turbulent states. We want them to get solved. We don't want to see some general war growing out of, as Bismarck said, some stupid thing in the Balkans, right? We don't want that. We want it solved. And people had better be reasonable. And a lot of demagogic careers of a lot of demagogic politicians may come out of this a little bit bruised and battered, but these politicians will be able to do fine in a world of peace, progress, prosperity beyond the visible squalls. So that's one. It's a step towards the condominium. I also, though, have to point out that when Assad gave this very good interview, which I like very much, and I like Assad, he says there's no difference between the U.S. because the U.S. Tries to manage terrorism and Russia is principally opposed to terrorism. The problem with that is the U.S. actually has been bombing ISIS, right, to some extent, whereas Russia, maybe not so much. However, we do have some Tupolev bombers, 6 Tupolev bombers coming out of southern Russia have clobbered some ISIS positions, right? Now, that's a very interesting gesture, right? That's something that doesn't quite happen every day. We wish it would. But you can see things seem to be converging. Now, the other side of this is, who are the enemies? Who is trying to sabotage President Obama's foreign policy for their own wretched purposes, right? In other words, new wars. Ashton Carter. Ashton Carter talks as if he were a state within a state. His spokesman, Peter Cook, said, well, we don't really like to cooperate with Russia, but if certain conditions are fulfilled, then we could have a conversation about that. Listen, Peter Cook, forget conversations. You're in the goddamn chain of command. And the president is at the top. He's the commander-in-chief. He orders you to do something. That is not an invitation to a conversation. It's an invitation to quick obedience and execution and implementation. So that's Ash Carter, right? He's a strange love. We know him. He comes from like the Herman Kahn school of world targets and megadeths. Unfit for office. Should be fired. And if he tries to sabotage this, make sure he is fired. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. It's the Friday before the opening of the dumpster fire in Cleveland. It's going to be the parade. It's going to be Donald Trump's. I think he's going to have all of his wives speaking. He'll have his children speaking. He'll have his the presidents of the various branches of the Trump organization will be speaking. He'll have an event where his press attaché comes out, and that will be Trump in disguise, giving a speech in disguise. Maybe some of the speakers will be recycled at different times of day. Most of his sports heroes have said no. Most of the stars of stage and screen and radio, television, they say no, they don't want to be there. It's the kiss of death. He's got no previous Republican president coming, right? The 2 Bushes have opted out. McCain says no. Romney says no. Ryan is going because he fears he will lose his job. So this is a pathetic performance, right? This is where we need the satires of Juvenal, that is Juvenal of the Rome and the predecessors there in the some of the Greek comedies. So there we are. That's going to be the convention. So we'll get some laughs, but at the same time it will be chilling, especially when you look at what this guy Pence represents, and Trump wants to put the scoundrel, the bounder Pence 1 heartbeat away, right? Remember, wasn't bad enough they put Hastert the bastard one heartbeat away, right? The child molester, as we now know. The Republicans did that to you. And now we're going to have a madman in the White House, and the backup is somebody who's he's not insane. Trump obviously insane, psychotic. Whereas with Pence, he's morally insane because his policies amount to genocide against the American people. A Tea Party lunatic, a Tea Party raving fanatic. at the Naval Observatory, right? The residence of the vice president. Look, on 29th of June, U.S. air power destroyed an ISIS convoy trying to get out of Fallujah, where they were getting defeated by the Iraqi army with the help of that same U.S. air support. But the Iraqi army rehabilitating itself, taking the point again, and so forth. So this was one day after the Istanbul bombing. Look back on this stuff, and you'll see what's the brainwash. The brainwash is silence in many ways. It's ISIS is winning, the world is ending, run for your lives on the one side, and then if ISIS gets hit hard, then no, they don't want to talk about that. They pass that over in silence. You have these funny situations where the invited guests on cable television talk about ISIS defeats as if everybody knew about them, except that the networks where they're speaking have never reported them. So this is one of these scenes. I hate to cite this stuff, but the killing along the highway out of Kuwait and back to Iraq, which I think was despicable, because those people were simply retreating. They were trying to carry out the UN resolution, but various butchers on the U.S. side wanted to do this. But in this case, these are ISIS killers who will fight again. So 200 terrorist vehicles were destroyed, 350 jihadis were killed. And that would have been, in terms of a dramatic narrative, right, if you want to have a narrative, which is what these media hounds think about, well, that would have been a great narrative, right? Point, counterpoint, right? You attack Turkey and then find your whole, what is that? A company or two, right? A brigade almost. You're getting them killed, and the war is on its way to ending. But they don't do that. You have to find out this. The only U.S. newspaper that's interested in this seems to be, for whatever reason, I don't know, USA Today. So if you go to Tarpley.net, as with all of these things, you're going to get the entire story on the Putin-Kerry talks, the resistance coming from Madman Ashton Carter and the 51 State Department imbeciles, backed up by, the Brian Williams and Christian Amanpour, and so forth. But the ISIS people took a very, very serious defeat, and the American people were never told. So, anybody who wants to defeat Trump in a presidential election had better get the word out that ISIS is collapsing. You could have, Kurdish troops in Raqqa tomorrow, and it wouldn't get anywhere on the U.S. media. So that's bad. Now, let's look at the madman Trump once again. Look, if you want to see the infantile macho psychology, the one-upsmanship, if you will, or attempted one-upsmanship of Sleazy Don, you needed to see him on O'Reilly last night. So this is O'Reilly essentially daring Trump, double daring Trump, and he leads him through a series of hoops, and each one of those is a macho dare, right? And you can see that underneath all the bluster, Trump is so insecure that he's got to go along with whatever alternative makes him look more of a macho. Now, look, this is the Hillary Clinton syndrome, but this is worse than the Hillary Clinton syndrome in the way that we saw it. So he comes on with O'Reilly, and O'Reilly says, I think we're in a world war. How about you? So what's he going to say? Well, no, it's really a police action, or it's really a, low intensity. No, he's going to say, yes, says Trump. We're in a world war. By the way, Le Pen, the elder, I think this is, right? Jean-Marie Le Pen, the Vichyssoise character, fascist sympathies going back to Pétain. That guy also says it's a world war. And then, so O'Reilly has to escalate. We need a declaration of war. And Trump has to say, yeah, I'm for it. Now, this would be the biggest imbecility of all time. Plus, Obama has been trying to get an authorization to use military force, right? Authorization to use military force. Obama has been trying to get that from the Congress for what, a year and a half? And they won't do it. As a matter of fact, Tim Kaine is one of the main guys trying to do that. And then O'Reilly says, we need to force NATO intervention. And Trump says, yeah. And then for each of these, he gives you a recycled boilerplate saying, those NATO allies, they don't pull their own weight. They're free riders. We notice that Trump is unwilling to blame the faulty security procedures of France or of Cazeneuve, the Freemason, but he's absolutely happy to criticize the U.S. because it means he can attack Obama and Hillary Clinton and the rest of them. So you want to see a hip shot. You want to see a hothead. Frankly, you want to see, I'm sure if you're, the Caliph there, Baghdadi is watching. Caliph Baghdadi has concluded from what he saw that you can force Trump to do things which are bad for the U.S., but which Trump thinks are necessary for his macho honor. You can goad him into doing those. You can get his goat, you can get under his skin and all the rest of it, and make him do things. And, of course, Trump is devoted as ever to the magic words of radical Islamic terrorism. You say those words, man, they're going to disappear. They're going to be on the defensive. We'll be back in just a second. Welcome back to Radio. So what we had last night was a bidding war of bluster and insanity on the part of Trump in particular, right? Since he was being led around by the nose, it was pathetic. You see the pathos of the macho, right? The fundamental insecurity and the bluster that's supposed to cover it up. And of course, with Trump, his father never cared about him. This is what is coming out of every pore, right? We have another biography of Trump. I'm not sure I can find the reference. Maybe I can do that in the second hour. But anyway, the point is, Trump and his friend would get on the subway in 1958, 1959, and I know the drill, and they went to Times Square, and there they found these novelty shops, right, junk shops, and Trump bought a knife. And when the father, Fred, of the KKK, when he found out that his son had bought a knife at Times Square, then he sent Donald off to New York Military Academy. Get the idea? And according to the biographer, this was a tremendous shock for Donald, who lost his father for all practical purposes. His father turned against him, where the boy obviously needed a father. So he didn't have a father when he needed one. And most of what he does, you can see it, is to try to make up for that. The other interesting one in that book, by the way, just as a parenthesis, is that Trump has said in public that he suffers from what he calls a mild case of obsessive-compulsive disorder. But at this military academy, when he became the platoon leader and the company commander for part of the school, he would go around and inspect the rooms of his subalterns, lucky them. And if you didn't have all the towels perfectly creased and perfectly aligned, in other words, the obsessive-compulsive aspect, right? Everything has to be arranged in a neat row. It's got to be precise. It's got to be flawless, meticulous. So Trump would get into fights with these subaltern cadets saying, your sheets are not perfectly folded and these towels are a disgrace. And he'd pull them out of the closets and throw them on the ground and make these poor jerks go back into to do that stuff. And then sometimes they'd fight with him. And one guy apparently jumped out of a window or was thrown out of a window by Trump. So this is a very sick guy, but you can see this quarrelsome nature. Right? This is the pathos of the psychotic macho, and that's Trump. And he's 70 years old. He cannot go beyond this. Right? This is simply his his tragic story, right? His infantile childhood trauma growing to take over the personality. All right, so with Trump also lives in a paranoid fantasy world, right? In this same interview with O'Reilly, Trump says, much of our youth is being lost. They're joining ISIS. Well, I mean, do we have any statistics on that? Can we check it? And then he says, I'm a big fan of the FBI. Hey, libertarians, you libertarians out there that have gone down the primrose path with Trump, after you were duped by Ron Paul, then you were duped by Rand Paul. You're going to be duped by a guy who says, we must have surveillance. I'm a big fan of the FBI. The libertarians, I'm afraid, mostly compensating for their disappointments with Trump by going blatantly racists, right? And they seem to be obsessed by electric power blackouts is the main thing. Well, too bad, right? Some people just they can't be a man for all seasons. So let's also look at Trump and Pence. Now, first of all, in terms of the technique, right? You can see the limits of Trump's subjectivist, autocratic, intuition-oriented proceedings, because he blew it, right? He muffed the whole Veep rollout, right? That's supposed to be a great moment for a campaign. What do you get? You get the Veep rollout, you get your convention, you get the debates, right? And that's it. So one of those has now been thrown into the garbage can by the infallible Trump, right? I always think of Hitler in the Soviet campaign, and you can see the many, many parallels. As of yesterday, the events in Nice had overtaken the U.S. campaign, and so Trump says, "Oh, in honor of those victims, I'm going to call off my originally scheduled announcement of my vice presidential candidate, which was supposed to happen at noon, 11 a.m. Today, Friday, right, the 15th of July. But then he said, no, I'm gonna delay it. The problem with that was that Pence, poor Pence, this pathetic fall guy and flunky and valet and stooge, Pence had to tell the Indiana election authorities, the Board of Elections in Indiana, what are you going to do, Pence? Are you going to be on the ballot as president or on the ballot as governor? Because you can't be both, and you got to tell us now, because we got to go print those ballots. So Pence, from 24 hours, Pence was left with his whole life and future up in the air. Pence was left slowly twisting in the wind. He was hung out to dry by Trump. And again, we're always remembering the meeting of George H.W. Bush with Dan Quayle on the steamboat when they practically kissed. That was an amazing scene in 1988. Anyway, Sleazy Don has wrecked his own choreography. He has. The whole moment has been, dissipated. There's supposed to be some kind of an event on Saturday, tomorrow, but that's no kind of news day, right? In other words, a weekend in the summer, midsummer, not going to get too much attention. Not too doggone good, like performance, hey? Sleazy Don. Now, the other one is Newt Gingrich. He wants to have the Sharia test. The Sharia test. What are you going to do? Ask somebody? You're going to say, do you believe in Sharia? And then they're supposed to say, yes, I do. And then you say, out you go. This is absurd, but at the serious level, there's a monstrosity. It's just a monstrosity. I don't know if Gingrich knows what he's talking about even. But of course it's unconstitutional, but I would say at an even deeper level, it's not practical. It's counterproductive, frankly. It's just wrong. Plus, what are you afraid of? You really think Sharia law is coming to the United States? I can tell you, there will be no Sharia law in the United States, right? We have, for better for worse, we have the Anglo-Saxon common law, and we have a pretty highly developed system of constitutional rights. The British have no resistance because they have no constitution. They say they have one, but it's like the Tao, right? It's everywhere and nowhere. The British Constitution is a legend. It's a series of legendary points, right? It's probably governed by precedents from King Arthur and the Round Table. It does not exist. And again, seriously, because many of the precedents that are thought to belong or to be included in the British Constitution are secret. They're from the Star Chambers and other secret dictatorial things. So, for example, are you going to get a straight answer? Is an act of parliament necessary to implement the Brexit? Nobody knows because it hasn't been done. And there's no constitutional jurisprudence that would do that. That's why you can have Sharia courts in the United Kingdom because, once you're dealing in legality, that's the way it goes. So Trump has muffed it. Now, in a second, let's come back and do the famous crimes. Mike Pence's greatest hits. He's a Koch brothers agent. Back in a minute. Welcome back to this hour of World Crisis. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Now that we've described the public relations failure of the great public relations genius, right? He can't orchestrate anything. He falls back on Twitter. That's nothing. Remember, Bush, the elder, had a steamboat. What did Bush the younger have? A battleship, an aircraft carrier? I don't know what he had. But you get the idea that this was bungled, botched, amateurish, silly. But now the merits or demerits of Pence, the governor of Indiana. Now, let's just say a word about Indiana. Indiana is not a normal state, as we found in looking into the career of Dan Quayle and the Pulliam family. The Pulliam family of racists controlled the Indianapolis Star, and this was horrible. And there's a story about Robert Kennedy being put into jail as a campaigner. He's out campaigning, and they put him in jail in Indianapolis, and they said, "Do you want a paper to read?" He said, I wouldn't mind, but not the Indianapolis Star, right? So that was the family from which sprang Dan Quayle. In the Civil War, the Indiana state legislature was full of copperheads, Confederate Democrats, defeatists. And defeatism is the big word about Trump that I would like to stress this week in the final segment if we still have time. But so the Governor Oliver Morton of Indiana, had to shut down the state legislature, right, and declare martial law, sure, against a rebellion by armed Confederate slave drivers and their sympathizers. And Indiana, therefore, stayed in the Union, but this was touch and go for a while. So Indiana is not a normal northern state. It's one that has had these copperhead problems, okay? And then we've had the Pulliams, as we say. Now, Pence, a puppet of the Koch brothers. K-O-C-H spells Koch? No, K-O-C-H spells Koch. Ask the late Ed Koch, mayor of New York, right? Was he Mayor Koch? No. So these are parvenus putting on airs, right? But we're not going to let them. Their name is Koch. So that's the big thing. Do you want to have a Koch puppet, signed, sealed, and delivered Koch puppet in the White House? Hey, libertarians, what do you say? Is that your freedom revolution? So it's a very defensive, right? It's a very meager goal. It means that Trump is so worried about keeping his reactionary base intact that he doesn't feel he can go on the offensive. He's got to stay on the defensive, try to solidify these traditional reactionaries. So there's no appeal here beyond the usual minority, unpopular Republican camp. Pence the former talk show host, by now you've heard it, Rush Limbaugh on caffeine. Decaf. So he's low energy, low energy. He's a holy roller. He's an evangelical Christian, and those people in politics deserve to be sifted 10 times over because they are not, they are rendering unto Caesar much more than is Caesar's, and to Mammon and to Moloch. That's the kind of person we have here with Pence. The Tea Party. I mean, that's the Koch connection, right? Because the Koch brothers took over the Tea Party. What nobody has really talked about is, or few that I've heard, Pence was not doing all that well in his gubernatorial reelection race. In other words, he'd been elected in 2012 in the Congress. I think I've actually been in to meet him once, some years back. But Pence, the latest poll was Pence was leading his Democratic challenger, a guy called Greg. This is in May of this year. Pence, 40%, Greg, 36%. But the internals were bad for Pence. 36% only thought that Pence deserved re-election. 40% approved of his job performance, and 42% disapproved. So he was underwater in some key categories. Maybe he wasn't giving up anything important, right? Maybe he was not going to win that anyway. It's perfectly possible. And this comes out of also some stuff that Carville of the Clinton machine said on the television the other day. But now let's get into the details here. Follower of Rush Limbaugh, so he's a host. Okay, increasing drug offenses, right? So it means mass incarceration, especially of black male youth. It means the prison industrial complex. It means that he's a racist, okay? He ran as somebody who was going to do criminal justice reform, and he has increased the possibilities for mass incarceration. Tax cuts for the rich, just what Koch ordered. So tax cuts for corporations, tax cuts for high-income individuals. This is worse than other Republican states. Pence signed a law which capped the state minimum wage in Indiana from going up. Forget about $15. Pence actually says that even increasing to $8.25 an hour is too much. In other words, you should never be above, $7.25 an hour, which is the federal minimum wage. And, of course, he is a union buster. A union buster. Hey, blue-collar guys out there duped by Trump. Do you like to have your union hall? Do you like to play, have a few beers and play cards or something in your union? You won't even have a union hall when this guy gets finished with you. Indiana is a right-to-work state. And this was done as part of the Pence operation. February 2012, they became a right-to-work state. This was the first state in more than 10 years that became a union-busting state. 23rd state overall, getting up towards half, to have a right-to-work law. So this essentially means that the union contract cannot force somebody being hired to start paying not even union dues, but representation fee, because they're bargaining for you, right? So you're a free rider. It promotes, the mentality of free riders, and I'm afraid scabs, among people in the workforce. So this, of course, is a disaster. Then, schools. The destruction of the educational system in Indiana by Pence, and this is privatization, the battle for control, he calls it. So it means that you've got to have charter schools, privatization policies, and, of course, in order to do that, you've got to bust the teachers' union, which is always one of the forces that can be relied on to try to defend some kind of public education. And that's why they're targeted, not because of their greed, but because they want to keep the old Horace Mann system, right? Something like free, universal, compulsory, and hopefully quality public education. So this is a big deal for Pence because he gets money from the various PACs, right? The various political action committees whose only raison d'etre, the only reason they exist, is to try to privatize schools. Now, there's this other thing where along comes the legislature and says, we want to be able to allow bigoted bakeries not to sell cakes to homosexuals. Absolute nonsense, right, for gay marriage. So he signed it, and then he had to take it back under business. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So the crimes of Pence. Pence, the agent of Koch. You're looking for a change? You're looking for a fresh face? Well, it's not Pence. This is a boring dummy, of course, who will put everybody to sleep. And that's maybe his goal, right? Because then the knife goes in once you're unconscious. So, as I said, the idea was that religious freedom, and this is such a fraud, if you're operating a common carrier, okay, common carrier is not just a stagecoach, a train, a bus, an airplane, a railroad, a dog cart, anything. If it's a common carrier open to the public, then you got to serve whoever shows up and has the money to buy a ticket. And these people say no, because that impinges on my rights, right? So it's always the right of the plutocrat, the oligarch, right? And we've done it, we've gone through in the past. This is the cuius regio eius religio. In other words, it was the desire of feudal lords in Germany in the middle 1500s to be able to dictate the religion of their peasants. And the Peace of Augsburg, right, in the middle of the century, said, yes, if it's your region, you can decide what the religion is. So this is the way, right? You're gonna, if I've got the monopoly on wedding cakes, then I'm not going to give you one, because otherwise that is sin, right? You can't do this. This has got to be essentially swept aside. So, what else? He's, of course, an opportunist. He's always against Obamacare, but he did take the Medicaid expansion. And the idea, of course, is this may be a kind of a Christie ploy where he takes the Medicaid expansion money and then steals it to run the state, so he doesn't have to raise taxes and get in trouble with his boss, Koch. So the big problem here with Pence. What else do we have? Oh, Pence had a bill to declare English the official language of the United States and would require English proficiency for naturalization. Yeah, that's great. Why don't you teach Trump to get from the second grade level where he is right now to a third grade level? Because, what level of English, right? Broken English out of the mouth of Trump. So he's got a great deal of animus on LGBT. He's up in arms about bathroom use, and he wanted to have his own propaganda machine. He wanted to have a state-funded news service where he could have his own lying propaganda put out. He wants to seriously interfere with what is now legal abortion, right, under Roe v. Wade, which is settled law. He's a big enemy of Planned Parenthood, and that includes the medical services. So that's him. He's a reactionary. He's a tired old reactionary hack. And that's Trump. And I hope their descent into the underworld together is coming soon. So he's not giving up anything. There was no guarantee he could get reelected. He was, to put it bluntly, unpopular. Yes, and that guy is going to go a heartbeat away. Obviously, in foreign policy, no clue. he will be led around by the neocons. That's maybe the most significant of all, right? He doesn't even have the sort of wretched, opinionated nonsense that you hear from Trump, right? So that's that. Now, let's see. Okay, concerning, we need to do the South China Sea. I'd like to say something about defeatism, but now here we go. The killer, the driver in Nice is this guy, Bouchliel. He's a Tunisian. He's 31 years old. According to Le Figaro, and I saw this myself, he was well known to the local police, but not to the French intelligence agencies. Now, what I would focus on is the absolutely insufficient preparation. If you're going to have 100,000 people in the streets on a night like this, on the 14th of July, right, the 14 juillet, then you have to set up barriers. You have to have comprehensive security, right? You have to have this. And they didn't have it. Now, the person that I would focus on here is the French Interior Minister, Cazeneuve. And I would want to know myself, why is Cazeneuve still the Interior Minister of France? Because you remember, January 2015, Charlie Hebdo, right? People killed in Paris, right, by Koulibaly and the Kouachi brothers. Bernard Cazeneuve was the Interior Minister, the Police Minister, the Internal Security guy. Doesn't mean interior in our sense, right? Doesn't mean national parks and mining and stuff. No, it means the Police Minister. So that was January 2015. Then Cazeneuve said, I'm going to bring in all these wonderful improvements, right? We're not going to get hit again because I'm going to fix everything. It'll never happen again. Then November, we have the attack at the sports stadium in Paris and at the musical theater in Paris. So there he is again, and that's still Bernard Cazeneuve. Why are you still there? Under the system of ministerial responsibility, if you're the sports minister and the national soccer team loses, you resign. If you're the transportation minister and there's a significant railway crash, you resign. You take responsibility, you leave. And it's we saw this with somebody like Ashcroft in the U.S. The position of Ashcroft was, the more I fail, the more power I should get. You can't have that. So if you have terrorist attacks that are successful and they occur on your watch, you have got to go. Because otherwise you get a perverse incentive to have more of these, right? And France has been around for quite a while, so they had this, and now they've given it up. So now we're on the third attack under Cazeneuve, okay? Cazeneuve's third attack. What could be involved? Well, Bernard Cazeneuve is a Freemason, and he's part of a cabinet and a government which is chock full of Freemasons of a certain type. And specifically the type is the Grand Orient, Le Grand Orient. And this is the Anglophile, sort of vaguely leftist Freemasonic lodges in France, but it extends into Italy and the Mediterranean. It's quite a widespread organization. In the years before World War I, these people went wild, and that may be what's happening right now. We'll be right back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So, what we're left with is the fact that the patsy in this case, I guess, was known to the local police as a petty thief, but supposedly not known to the intelligence agencies. How is that possible? And above all, then, this truck the truck apparently waited for quite some hours before going into action. Right? In other words, he wanted to be in position, and he got himself into position. And then he drove for 2 kilometers. It means 1.2 miles along the Promenade des Anglais, killing people, right? Going 70 miles an hour at some points, got it floored, plowing through these crowds, crushing people, and simply going over them, running them over. Okay, how can this happen? Cazeneuve, Are you going to take responsibility? Or are you going to be in power forever? He is a Freemason. It is well known that he's a Freemason. And he's part of a Freemasonic government. The Socialist Party of France, and this goes from Mitterrand and many others, right? People of all kinds of political colorations, are members of the Grand Orient of France. Okay? Le Grand Orient de France, or de la France. Grand Orient de France, so G-O-F is the key idea. Now, who else? I say this is a government that's full of it. Well, the predecessor of Cazeneuve is Manuel Valls. Manuel Valls is now the Prime Minister of France. He was promoted up. He says he's no longer in it. Valls was brought into the Grand Orient of France in the 1980s by a socialist official in Paris. Valls has claims that he's less engaged in Freemasonry since 1996. Jean-Yves Le Drian, Grand Orient, right? He was the finance minister. Jérôme Cahuzac, C-A-H-U-Z-A-C. This was the guy who got caught in the Panama Papers, and it was found that he had a shell company in the Seychelles, and that he was doing tax evasion, a member of the Grand Orient of France. So we've also got, then I'm not going to go through the names, but Minister for Relations with the Parliament, Freemason. Then he becomes let's see, he's part of the government, right? He's part of the team. A woman, Anne-Marie Escoffier, she's the Minister for Decentralization. She's part of La Grande Loge Féminine de France. Okay? And so forth. Here we have the Minister for Transport and Merchant Marine. We have the Chief of Staff of the former Prime Minister, and it just goes on and on. I'm reading, by the way, if you want to read some French, this is all from Le Nouvel Observateur. The article is called "These Freemasons Who Govern Us, ces francs-maçons qui nous gouvernent." And this is from the 6th of January, 2013. You get the idea? All those characters. Now, here's the idea. We are living now in the world of the British-Chinese alliance. This is extremely serious. I want to remind everybody that this Grand Orient of France is Anglophile. It goes back to Edward VII. Those are his people. Remember, as Prince of Wales, Edward VII lived in Paris, right? And he promoted the careers of people like Clemenceau. There's a very good body of evidence that Edward VII pulled a lot of strings in the so-called Dreyfus affair. But the idea now is, in the years before World War I, you had the Freemasons going crazy. I think we have entered into a period in which the pro-British Anglophile Freemasons worldwide are being called upon to mobilize in favor of the British-Chinese alliance. You remember what this is, right? Anybody who was anti-British or anybody who was pro-peace in the 20 or 25 years before 1914 had a good chance of getting killed if they got anywhere. Stolypin, the Prime Minister of Russia, wanted to reform Russia, and he always said, the one thing I can't tolerate is war, no more war. That was one. He was killed maybe 10 years before the war started. Rasputin, the mad monk, at least had the one good idea. He told the Tsar, stay out of this war. And there was an attempt to kill him in June, July 1914, as well as then the final one in December 1916. So that's Russia. In the case of France, of course, it's Jean Jaurès, the Socialist Party politician who gets killed just as the war is starting, and also the Radical Party politician Caillot, who is also looking for a negotiated settlement with Germany. And he is essentially knocked out by a slander campaign, whereas his wife then goes in and kills the editor of Le Figaro. In Austria-Hungary, the main peace person was Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So by killing him, this Anglophile Freemasonic network, in this case through the Serbian Black Hand, they secured the elimination of the main voice for peace, and at the same time then created this hysteria. Very interesting is the case of Italy. I've talked in the past about General Alberto Pollio, who was the military commander of the Italian forces, the head of the Italian general staff. He was going to send 12 divisions through Austria, through Germany, making a kind of a swing round the circle, and then getting them. They were going to go to the Upper Rhine, and that would have been 12 divisions, one field army, which the Germans would not have covered, and that meant the Germans could have put a whole extra field army on the right wing of the Schlieffen Plan deployment, and that might have ended the whole thing very quickly. There's also, though, the question of King Umberto I. This is King Humbert of Italy, assassinated in Monza, near Milan, in 1900. And what's with him? He is pro-Vienna. He likes Austria-Hungary. That's his cultural preference. Of course, he's got to be assassinated by an anarchist. So what I am suggesting is, through whatever mediations and specifics, I say we are likely now to be entering into a time when the Chinese-British alliance is going to be lashing out. I think that's what we're dealing with now. And this means, among other things, the mobilizations of all of their networks, of all kinds of dangerous people. And as Freemasons, it's not so common to talk about Freemasons here in the United States anymore, but they are there, believe me, and they will come to you. Otherwise, I'd like to know, what is the explanation that this Cazeneuve is now still in power after 3 colossal failures, whereas the general rule of ministerial responsibility is a failure of that magnitude. 1 strike and you're out. As soon as it happens, goodbye, you have failed, right? Find something else to do. So the other funny thing I found in this was the head of what amounts to the Communist Party of France, Mélenchon, of the Front de Gauche, is a Freemason of this precise Grand Orient. So the socialists and the communists are together in the Grand Orient, even as they fight in public for the Mickeys. So we'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Now, we've talked about this somewhat shady manifestation of the British-Chinese alliance, but in this case, we also need to add the Chinese side of it. So what does this look like? The South China Sea. Please go to Tarpley.net. There you will find a briefing that we prepared, including a nice map. The South China Sea is an area through which flows 1/3 of all world trade. 1/3 of all world trade goes through that sea, right? And it's about $5 trillion worth. And this is, of course, of immediate interest to Japan, to Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, Republic of China, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia, you name it. All of these countries are interested. And the problem, of course, is that the People's Republic of China, in order to compensate for the incompetence and instability created by this new team of President Xi and Prime Minister Li, those two bunglers have bungled the whole economic situation with the stock market, right? They apparently got hooked on some kind of free trade or free market ideology, right? That stimulus was bad. When they came in, that was the one thing they knew. And they said that to the four winds, right? Stimulus is bad. But Well, that then brought down the stock market by 30 or 35%, whatever it was, between 2014 and 2015. Now, the problem of the Chinese Communist Party is that they lack legitimacy. They don't have legitimacy because nobody elected them. Why are they there? How dare they impose their choices and so forth? And what's their plan for modernizing that system? Well, the answer is they don't have one, right? It's a ponderous, huge bureaucracy, but it doesn't prevent them from being totally incompetent, total fools, and now adventurists, covering their incompetence with adventurism. And that is to say, they say, well, there are these rocks, right? There are the Paracels Islands and there are the Spratly Islands, and these are things, some of this stuff is underwater at high tide or barely visible. So they go and build these artificial islands around them, and then they say this all belongs to us. So they're saying that their territorial waters reach out 1,000 miles from their coast down towards the south, through most of the South China Sea. Well, what's the basis for this? Well, they say we have the 9-dash map, which was a unilateral map created by Mao, in effect, Mao's gang, Chu Enlai and Mao, and they said, here's our starting position, right? Here's what we claim in the negotiations, with anybody, with Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists on Formosa and the rest of this stuff. And it's an extravagant, inflationary claim. I have to remind you, the U.S. position on this question has always been the freedom of the seas. This is not the same as the Monroe Doctrine. This does not affect who controls countries. This is simply, do ships have the right to sail all over the world ocean? And the interesting thing about this is that it's the doctrine of the mare clausum, right, the closed sea, originates with the Venetians. And, of course, from the Venetians it goes to the British. But the idea is the mare clausum, closed sea, was what the Venetians asserted for the northern Adriatic, right? The Venetians said the northern Adriatic is the Gulf of Venice. So if you're in some place like Pola or these other rivals of Venice, you're out of luck. You have to kowtow to us, and we'll tell you what ships can go where, and you've got to bring all your products to our staple port and things like this. It's very interesting. The principal antagonists, well, it goes from Venice, right, that the Gulf of Venice is a closed sea, to the British, who imposed this frequently. The principal opposition comes from the Dutch. The Dutch say no, mare liberum, everybody can go where they want, the freedom of the seas. And the U.S. has then also taken over this notion of the freedom of the seas. The Chinese simply say all of this belongs to us. And there's 11 trillion barrels of oil at the bottom of the South China Sea, another refutation of the peak oil freaks of 10 or 12 years ago. So the Chinese say the Paracel Islands belong to us, the Spratly Islands belong to us, and it goes all the way down practically to, it goes past Brunei. Take a look at the map that we have. It goes way down south below Vietnam. And the Chinese simply say, this all belongs to us. Now, this is intolerable. And this is very dangerous. The escalation of this is anybody's guess. We get reports, which are unverifiable so far, of various admirals around the world telling their people, watch out, we may have a war here soon. And it all depends on this clique of unstable bunglers in Beijing. And it's a very big issue. Say, okay, China, now you've succeeded economically, but do you have any maturity? Right? You claim to be an old country, but you're acting in an infantile and unacceptable manner. And It's no use blaming the U.S. on this, because blaming this on the U.S., but most of those countries, right, be it Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Philippines. The Philippines, by the way, were the ones who brought the complaint. This is an opinion that came from the Hague Permanent Court of Arbitration. Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia. They're all very upset because they feel that their rights are being subjected to simple, disregard by the imperious Chinese. And this is quite a number of large countries, right, starting with Japan. So this could become very dangerous. This has the stuff of the Third World War. So the Chinese they've become economic upstarts, and then in terms of maturity and statesmanship, they're completely out to lunch. Notice any number of people around the world who want to cover this up. The Asia Times published infantile articles saying, well, let's appease China by giving them everything they want. And if we have to go around the South China Sea, it really doesn't cost that much, right? That's the new appeasement that you're going to be hearing from forces favorable to the British-Chinese alliance. Also, needless to say, the LaRouche group is kowtowing like mad to this Chinese performance. So you get the idea. Now, you would ask China, have you been harassed? Has anybody threatened your rights to go through the South China Sea? I don't know, but it looks to me like there has been no such attempt. So what is it that you want? What is it that you're trying to do? Because with this kind of logic, you can spread this all around the world. It would be like the U.S. saying, the Gulf of Mexico belongs to us. The Caribbean belongs to us. All the islands belong to us, down to the coast of Venezuela, right? Absurd. It would be unacceptable, and it should be unacceptable. So the Chinese claim was, we have always dominated this sea. This is like the Venetian claim. They said, per immemorabile consuetudine. So for time out of mind, for a custom that has been around as long as anybody can remember, we have controlled the Gulf of Venice. And, of course, they hadn't. And in this case, hey, China, you don't have a continuous domination of these seas, right? So this is extremely dangerous. And the first thing to do is get these various quislings and appeasers of China to shut up, because this is simply unacceptable, and anybody who pursues that will be discredited. So, and it's an election issue. So we'll see you next week. We'll be, again, stay tuned to Tarpley.net and Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed during the Republican dumpster fire, and we'll see you various times next week, and then back here. Good afternoon.